Hello and welcome. I'm Tom Kucharski, your host for tonight's episode of Look Up Tonight. This is the cable show of the Orange County Astronomers. We are one of the largest amateur astronomy clubs in the country and invite everyone to watch our show and learn what our club is all about and how you can learn about this wonderful hobby. Orange County Astronomers has activities for all levels of amateur. Many new amateurs take part in our Beginner's Astronomy program at the Old Centennial Heritage Museum in Santa Ana. We also hold monthly star parties locally at Black Star Canyon, in addition to our large desert site outside of Anza, 30 miles east of Temecula. Another popular activity is our monthly club meeting, which is open to the general public. We were very lucky to host a special speaker for our most recent meeting. Our show tonight features Charlotte Herschel Farquharson, who is the great-great-great-granddaughter of Sir William Herschel, the famed 18th century astronomer who discovered the planet Uranus. You will hear in the presentation that Sir William Herschel certainly set a very high standard for achievement. The later generations have also left their mark with some very important contributions to science and technology. You will probably be surprised to hear how the Herschel family is also directly connected with the science of fingerprinting, the photographic process, and the contact lens, to name but a few. Now, let's find out about the Herschel family from Charlotte Herschel Farquharson.
A few months ago, I was asked by the Herschel Society in Japan to give them a talk to celebrate the 20th anniversary of their founding. And having accepted, I found myself having to delve into the many books that are written about William Herschel and to assemble a talk about a family which has boasted over 3 generations a number of discoveries which have opened up the minds of men or benefited mankind in some way. And from there, the ball has rolled, and here I am with you all, with the Orange County Astronomers, and I really am delighted and thrilled to be so, especially after 2 weeks in Japan. I am very proud to be a direct descendant of William Herschel through the male line, and to realize as the years go by that, and mankind moves further and further into space and into the planets, that William Herschel is an immortal contributor to a wide spectrum of human knowledge and achievement. And not just William, there he is, but his sister Caroline, his son John, 2 of his grandsons, William James and Alexander. And what I want to do is to tell you something about the Herschels as a family, where they came from, the events which shaped them, and the work which mapped the direction of their lives. The family origins are, of course, German, and the name Herschel is considered to be Jewish, although, as far as we know, the family's been of Christian persuasion for a long time before 1650. The proliferation of Old Testament Bible names in the earlier recorded generations is simply a matter of the fashion of the times. If you think about it, Isaac Newton had an Old Testament name. So I must go back to the first record that we have, and it was written by Isaac Herschel, William's father, and he told of the family origins as far as he knew them. William's great-grandfather Abraham was born in 1651, and he worked as a brewer in a town called Pirna, which is near Dresden, and that's on the eastern part of Germany, near the Czechoslovakian border. Abraham then moved on to be a gardener on a big estate near Magdeburg, where he married a girl called Eva Mavis, who was the daughter of a man who dyed cloth. Abraham and Eva had 4 children, of whom the youngest was Isaac, and he was born in 1707. In his turn, Isaac became a gardener, but his real interest was music, and he bought himself a violin on which he taught himself to play. He became proficient enough to relinquish gardening to become a full-time musician. Isaac moved on to Hanover, and he joined the local militia as an oboist in the Hanoverian Foot Guards. He married a girl called Anna Ilse Moritzen in 1732 when he was 25, and from the records it looked as though he had to marry her. Because they were very ill-suited. Anna seems to have had a scolding, bad-tempered personality They had 10 children altogether, of whom 6 survived. 4 died as babies of various plagues and illnesses. Now, as a father, Isaac was unusually involved in the intellectual upbringing of his children, and he was a man who had imaginative intelligence. He once gathered his children around a barrel filled to the brim with water, and he used the reflection to show them the phases of a solar eclipse. Isaac died in 1767, and he's buried in the churchyard of the Gartenkirchhof in Hanover. It's very fortunate that this church survived the total devastation, and I do mean total devastation, of Hanover by Allied bombing during the Second World War, by only about 100 meters. And if you're able to visit Hanover, you'll find this grave and that of Caroline quite easily. The day we visited was so hot we nearly fainted. You can see how bright the sun was. Isaac's 6 surviving children were Sophia, who was born in 1733, Jacob in 1734, William, the great William, in 1738, Alexander in 1745, Caroline in 1750, and the youngest was Dietrich, and he was born in 1755. All the children, except perhaps Sophia, inherited their father's musical talent, which was considerable. Sophia married a foul-tempered musician called Jacob Griesbach. He was not only foul, but he was dangerous. And their many sons became musicians at the court of King George III in England. And there are interesting records about them and their work in the archives at Windsor Castle. Sophia died in 1803, and her descendants live for the most part in Canada. The second child, Jacob, also became a musician, and it's probable that Jacob was a better musician than his younger brother William, because it seems that some of Jacob's compositions have been wrongly attributed to William. Jacob seems to have been a rather feckless and self-serving character, and his death was violent and mysterious because he was found dead in a field and he'd been strangled. He was about 56 when that unfortunate thing happened to him. The third surviving child was, of course, William, and Alexander was the next son, and he was devoted to William, and he joined him in the city of Bath in 1770, and he lived there and worked there as a musician and able astronomer's assistant until he returned to Hanover in retirement in 1816. Alexander was a practical man, and he did much of the work of the construction for the telescopes which William came to need eventually for his observations. In fact, he was so good at this that William suggested that Alexander go into business making telescopes, for which there came to be a great demand after William had become famous. A Herschel telescope was a status symbol. Alexander retired to Hanover, and he died there in 1821. Caroline was the 5th child. I'm sorry, I don't have early pictures of these people. And she was the second daughter. And her life eventually became so firmly intertwined with that of her brother William that it's very hard to separate the achievements of their joint lives. The last of the children was Dietrich. He was much younger, and he too was a musician. His hobby was entomology, and he studied butterflies and moths and insects. And he taught William his method of cataloguing specimens, and it was a skill which William found useful when he came to cataloguing the stars of the Northern Hemisphere. Dietrich married, and he had 4 children. His son was called Heinrich, and he emigrated to America, where his descendants still live. And that's an outline of the family of Isaac and Alla Herschel. It's obvious that they were all talented as musicians and that they were actually a close family throughout their lives. Their childhoods were played out against the backdrop of continual war. They weren't rich, but it would seem that they didn't go short of food, clothing, or education. But what's extraordinary is that there's a library of information about the whole family, and they're individually mentioned in the journals and the chronicles of their times. And where the Herschels are concerned, it's not a question of searching for information about them, it's a question of making decisions about what to leave out. And this is a family of very humble origins, and I think that's probably unusual. Now we'll come to the intertwined story of William and Caroline. And I'll begin with an outline of William's character and his early adult life. Oh, there's Caroline. We'll move on. William was born on the 15th of November in 1738, and he was as well educated as the rest of the family. The father, Isaac himself, was the source of much of the education of his children, and he actively encouraged them in the exploration of philosophy, natural philosophy, which is the old word for science, mathematics and languages. And he passed on his working knowledge of astronomy to his children. His encouragement and his imaginative teaching had a profound effect on William, who was the most intelligent of his sons and whose intellectual curiosity was woken at an early age. Throughout his life, William was interested in anything and everything that came his way. William had a fluent knowledge of French, and he wrote many of his early letters in French. He had good Latin, good Italian, and he was, of course, fluent in German, which is his native language, and he spoke English and wrote it like an Englishman. As a youth, on his first visit to England with the Hanoverian Foot Guards when he was 16 or 17, he was employed as an oboist, and he scraped together enough money to buy a complicated book for the time by a man called Thomas Locke on human understanding, which it's a difficult treatise, and it's not a usual purchase for a young man who's usually rather more interested in other things than philosophy. And he discussed this book and many other fairly profound matters in the letters which he exchanged with his brother Jacob. And it's very fortunate that Jacob preserved this correspondence. Why he should have done so, I just don't know, but it gives us a great insight onto William's life as a young man. William had a short return to Germany, where he became involved in the Battle of Hastenbach, which was one of the battles of the 7 Years' War and had something to do with one country owning something that another country thought they shouldn't own. As a musician, William wasn't required to fight, but he spent the night in a flooded ditch while cannonballs and musket fire flew over his head. And after this, his father encouraged him to leave the Foot Guards and to return to England, which was a much more stable country. There's always been controversy about the way in which William left the Foot Guards, with accusations that he went absent without leave. But family papers show that he was not employed as a soldier, but as a musician. And as a musician, he wasn't subject to military law. We've got a signed official paper to show that he did leave the Foot Guards quite legitimately. And judging by this picture, he was quite good looking, don't you think? And I like to think that I've inherited his nose. Although over a distance of nearly 300 years, I think it's probably unlikely. William's character seems to have been very pleasant. He had charm, and he had a light and a friendly disposition. He was kind, he was thoughtful, he was practical, methodical, curious, imaginative, self-disciplined, very energetic, and extremely hard-working. But to balance these good qualities, he did have a very sharp temper when it was needed. He was a better-than-average musician. He was skilled on several instruments, including the organ, and he could compose very pleasing music when required. I've got a CD with me, if we can stand a bit of it when we finished. He kept journals and notebooks about his activities throughout his life, and he and his family kept almost everything which constituted a record of any kind, and it's because of this that we know so much about the Herschels as a family. William returned to England with his brother Jacob in the autumn of 1757. They were almost penniless, and they quickly embarked on the work of copying music, which put some money into their pocket. But then Jacob was offered a job back in Hanover as a prestige job, leading the court orchestra, and he went back to Hanover, and William stayed on in England on his own. William found work quite quickly, playing and teaching and composing music, and he had it in mind to become well known or even famous as a musician and a composer. His work took him, riding on a horse, all over the north of England, particularly Yorkshire, and while he rode, he read his books, and he once lost concentration so much that he fell off, and another time he fell asleep in the saddle. It was a lonely and vagrant life, which he enjoyed for the interesting and influential people he met and he made friends with, but which he hated for the intervening loneliness. And for solace, he wrote copiously to his family and took as his subjects everything from philosophy, harmonics, and composition to religion and the charms of some of the young ladies he was meeting. He built up a good reputation all over the north, and he settled eventually in Leeds to work as an organist. It was from Leeds that he applied for a job to be an organist at the parish church in Halifax, which he wanted because the organ was to be modern and newly installed. And at that time, organs were rapidly replacing wind and string instruments for the playing of music in churches. And William didn't have too much trouble to be accepted for this job, although he claimed he'd cheated to get it. He'd put lead weights on some of the keys on the organ, and that gave it a wide and rolling sound, and it got him the job. But he didn't stay in Halifax for very long, because he was offered the post of organist and music master at the newly built Octagon Chapel in Bath in the west of England. Actually, we're quite lucky to have this photograph of the Octagon Chapel, because it was dismantled years and years ago, and the building is now used as a community centre. But in Herschel House in Bath, we do have a few of the pipes on display from this organ. Back in William's time, 1766, when he went to Bath, it was a little town, and it had expanded very rapidly from the watering hole, which had first been used by the Romans, and it had become the premier resort and spa in England, with a massive building programme, which caused it to become one of the most attractive towns in the country. Have any of you been to Bath? It's a pretty place. Its rapid growth came about as the result of the many wars going on in Europe, which had made travel for everyone hazardous. As a spa, Bath needed a musical director, and this position soon came William's way. This work, along with actual playing, rehearsals, composing, teaching, as many as 8 pupils a day, kept William extremely busy, though not too busy to avoid having his name associated with several pretty young women, particularly a very forward widow called Mrs. Colebrook. I'm glad to say she went on a few years later to get married to somebody else. This slide shows one of the advertisements which was put on display to advertise one of William's concerts. You'll see that Caroline features as the lead singer, but this was an occupation which she gave up when she realized how much her brother needed her assistance in other ways. Within 3 years of his arrival in Bath, William was able to report that his income was £316 a year, and by 1771 it had gone up to £400. And I've got one of my sons-in-law to go into the internet to be able to tell you that that in sterling is about £35,000 in present-day money. Considering tax was so low, that was a pretty good income. All William's energies went into his work and into his plans for helping his family to share in his good fortune. During his time in Bath, his brothers, Jacob, Alexander, and Dietrich, all came and went to work as musicians with William, but Alexander stayed on permanently. Here's a view of Bath. But back in Hanover, Caroline was approaching womanhood, and she was becoming deeply concerned about her future. She'd had the great misfortune to have been badly scarred and disfigured by smallpox as a little girl, and as a result of having suffered from typhus when she was about 4, she was also very small, about 1.45 meters. And her father had gently warned her that her chances of marriage were very slight. And she wasn't getting any encouragement from her mother or any of her brothers to have training which would equip her to work. She had dressmaking lessons for a short time, and she was an exquisite needlewoman throughout her life, and she also had singing lessons because she had a good singing voice. But these attempts to better herself came to nothing, and her naturally gloomy nature turned to depression at the prospect of spending the rest of her life as a household drudge in Hanover. William was astute enough to realize that she had to be rescued, no matter what the rest of the family might say. And so to appease his mother, for the loss of her daughter, William agreed to pay the yearly cost of a servant. And in this way, he was able to remove Caroline from Hanover and take her back to Bath. And the journey had its adventures because there was a ferocious storm in the North Sea, and it snapped the ship's mast and blew it so far off course that the passengers had to land off the very bleak Norfolk coast. It is like this, and they landed early in the morning in a fog. And they had to wade to shore, dragging their luggage with them. And then when the coach from that part of the country was going down to London, it overturned and threw them into a ditch. So it was not a journey they enjoyed very much. Caroline reached Bath with William at the end of August in 1772. And because she couldn't speak any English, she found settling into her new country an experience fraught with difficulties. But with the application with which she approached every problem, Caroline quickly learnt basic English, and she was out in the local market doing her shopping within 6 weeks of her arrival in England. But she never knew that Alexander was following her, keeping an eye on her to see that she was safe. She took over all the accounts, the management, and the housekeeping of the household. And pleasure for her came in the form of conversations with William, but she was ill at ease with his friends because she knew herself to be too forthright, probably rude, and direct and unpretentious. And those sort of manners were not at all fashionable at that time, or perhaps at any time. Throughout her life, she found it difficult to make friends. She did her best to please in everything she did, and she was self-effacing and shy and rather frightened of criticism, and she went out of her way to avoid those things. Her lonely soul attached itself to William, and from that time on, her whole life was lived with his comfort and well-being her foremost and only concern. She was devoted to him. William had come to England to live and to work in 1757. The country was very stable compared with Europe, and it was also just beginning to move into what became the Industrial Revolution. All over the country, particularly around Birmingham, manufacturers, entrepreneurs, amateur scientists and self-taught engineers were gathering to discuss ideas and to work out solutions to the problems created by their work and their ambitions. These men, great and small, were the men who ushered in the modern age, and they weren't just interested in their own fields of endeavour, but in all the new ideas and inventions and discoveries which were powering the establishment of new methods of manufacture. They gathered themselves into societies and clubs to exchange their thoughts and findings. And these clubs didn't specialize, but discussed every innovation, sharing their findings and thoughts on every subject from harnessing steam to botany, timekeeping, ceramic glazes, medicine, surgery, and poetry, to name but a few. And William was lucky to find himself in England at such a time. And he joined one of these societies in Bath, which helped him to open his mind even further to new ideas. Now, this engraving was made in 1862 as a homage to the men who had contributed so much to England in the previous 100 years. And you can see William sitting behind the globe in the left-hand corner. Can you see there? Rather fat by that time. And next to him is his great friend, the Astronomer Royal Neville Maskelyne. And the short man standing behind Neville Maskelyne is Peter Dolland, who was an optician and a lens maker, and who supplied William with lenses and founded an optical company which still exists in England. Next, sitting down on the left of Maskelyne, is Edward Jenner, who worked out the importance of inoculation against smallpox. James Watt, the pioneer of steam power, is sitting to the right of the table, and there are altogether 50 men in this picture who made enormous contributions to modern thought. William's interest in astronomy was further fired by his involvement in the Bath Philosophical Society, and it followed on from his mathematical studies which he'd needed for his musical work, and these, among others, were the books which he studied and read continuously. And in May 1773, there's a note in his journal, "I bought a book of astronomy and one of astronomical tables." He had worked then in Bath for a good 15 years as a musician. So he was taking up a new hobby. And from this followed the necessity to supply himself with the instruments which would enable him to pursue his new hobby. But telescopes were available, but they weren't of particularly high quality or sufficient magnification. And so the practical William set about making his own, as you do. And with the help of his brothers and of Caroline, wooden tubes and frames were constructed, lenses were ground, eyepieces were made or modified, and mirrors made and polished. And it was all extremely hard work. And it wasn't only hard work, but it was dangerous, because once when the molten metal which was being poured into the mold, which was lined with powdered horse dung, and we've had a great conversation in Japan about how this could be done, and if anybody knows how to make a mold with powdered horse dung, would they see me later? The mold cracked, and the superheated metal flowed onto the floor, where the heat split the flagstone so that the fragments flew in all directions with the speed of missiles, and they were actually very lucky to survive that particular incident, which took place at number 19 New King Street in Bath, and if you visit you'll be able to see the cramped and dark conditions under which they worked. It's the scullery up at the top. At the bottom it's the kitchen, but beyond a room which we supposed was used as a storeroom or maybe as a dining room. And it's almost impossible to describe the frenetic and frantic pace of the lives of the Herschel family during these years. The days were filled with teaching music and rehearsals and playing and orchestras and composing and concerts and all the rest of it. And every free moment was taken up with astronomy and the making of telescopes, stellar observation, cataloguing, and attendance at scientific meetings, at which William frequently presented a paper on some subject or other, not necessarily astronomy. William began to correspond with the leading astronomers of the day. Maskelyne in England and Aubert in France were among them, and he began to build the friendships with them which lasted for their lifetimes. Herschel's systematic observation of the heavens was gaining him a serious reputation. And in the background, Caroline was doing all the work of recording and cataloguing and solving the sums involved. William had almost had to teach her mathematics in order to do it. And sadly, Caroline wasn't with William. On the night of the 13th of March 1781, she was busy elsewhere, and William himself was more concerned with his work determining the distances of fixed stars. And for this purpose, he had begun a systematic review of the entire visible sky of the Northern Hemisphere, with the special object of finding suitable pairs of stars from which to calculate their distances. And so if it happened that in the course of the survey a hitherto unknown planet happened to be in his way, he was bound to discover it, because his admirable homemade telescope revealed him at once its difference from a fixed star. William's own description of the event which changed his life reads like this: "It's generally been supposed that it was a lucky accident that brought this star to my view. This is an evident mistake. In the usual manner, I examined every star of the heavens, not only of that magnitude, but many far inferior, and it was, that night, its turn to be discovered. I had gradually perused the great volume of the author of nature, and was now come to the page which contained a seventh planet. Had business prevented me that evening, I must have found it the next, and the goodness of my telescope was such that I perceived its planetary disk as soon as I looked at it, and by the application of my micrometer, I determined its motion in a few hours." I can only imagine that those hours were heart-stopping. William reported his discovery to Neville Maskelyne and to others and to the Royal Society. And there was great excitement, but some credulity and also controversy as to whether it was a planet or a comet, because it had been observed by others, and because other astronomers had reported what they had assumed to be a comet in the position in which William had identified it as a planet. And there was disbelief that it had been possible for William to have seen anything at all until he pointed out the extraordinarily high magnification of his telescope, which was better by far than anything else available at that time. Within a few months, however, William's discovery was accepted as a planet, and he was awarded the Copley Medal and elected to be a Fellow of the Royal Society. And because he wasn't averse to a little bit of flattery, William named his planet Georgium Sidus, George's star, in honor of the King George III. Later on, as the result of unwillingness on the part of continental astronomers to call the planet George, or even Herschel, it became known as Uranus. Uranus, in Greek mythology, is the personification of the sky, who, as a god, ruled the universe and fathered Venus and the Titans. And it is pronounced Uranus. William was catapulted almost overnight into national and international fame. His hitherto unknown name was a puzzle to newspaper editors all over Europe, and they spelt his name variously as M-E-R-S-T-H-E-L, H-E-R-S-T-H-E-L, H-E-R-T-S-C-H-E-L, and the French really got it right. They spelt it H-O-R-O-C-H-E-L-L-E. And then, because he had a living to earn and contracts to fulfill, William returned from London to Bath. That summer, though, his obsession with astronomy became absolute, and the house was turned into even more of a workshop for the polishing of mirrors, the construction of bigger and better telescopes, including the large 20-foot telescope, which eventually became William's favorite instrument. Those of you who have been to number 19 New King Street will realize what chaos that house must have been, because it's not a big building at all. Caroline was kept very busy copying catalogues, tables and papers, as well as providing meals and refreshments at all times of the day and night. There were times when William was so preoccupied with observing that Caroline had, as she put it later in a journal, to feed him by putting the victuals by bits into his mouth. Sometimes it was so cold that the ink froze in her ink pot. The King, George III, summoned William to Windsor and asked him to bring his telescope with him. The King was impressed, and after some complex negotiations, William was honoured to be offered the post of King's Astronomer. Not Astronomer Royal, because that's a state appointment. He was personal astronomer to George III. And he was retained at a stipend of £200 a year out of the King's own pocket, with his only obligation to be available to show the royal family and their guests the heavens whenever required. And apart from this duty, William was going to be free to devote himself entirely to astronomical research. It's interesting to note that George III was seriously interested in astronomy, and he owned a number of Herschel telescopes, which the royal family still have. Through one of them, he joked that he could see clear over the horizon and back to his childhood home in Hanover. And another time, he was showing the Archbishop of Canterbury how the telescope worked, and he said, "Come, my lord, and I will show you the way to heaven." And it's a great pity that this intelligent, steady, decent king is remembered more for his so-called madness than he is for his encouragement of every branch of science and the arts. He was the longest-serving British monarch. Our present Queen will probably outserve him. And he reigned for 63 years, of which only 3 or 4 years, maybe slightly more, were taken up by his very serious blood condition, which caused him to appear to be mad. He wasn't mad, he was simply very ill. And so with the king as his patron, William relinquished all his commitments, and he travelled down the Great West Road from Bath to Slough, and rented a house which was convenient in every way, and it eventually came to be called Observatory House. It remained in family possession until the 1960s, when it had to be demolished because it was riddled with every sort of rot, beetle and woodworm. And it's a great pity that the Slough Council didn't realise what a treasure they had in their midst, because it could have become a major museum devoted to the history of astronomy and to space exploration. Slough is about 4 miles from Windsor, where the king lived, and it's now a very, very dreary town specializing in light industry. A year after the great discovery, William was able to become a full-time astronomer and to devote all his time to observation and research and to the planning and construction of bigger and better telescopes. And Caroline became his full-time and unpaid assistant, and without her selfless application, he wouldn't have been able to achieve a quarter of the immense volume of work which he completed. At William's suggestion, Caroline started practical observing on her own account, using a small refracting telescope to search for comets. And a year or so after the discovery of Uranus, Caroline located 3 new nebulae, which William kindly credited to her when he added them to the growing list of discoveries. She found her first comet in 1786, and others between then and 1797. In fact, she discovered 8 comets altogether, and at one point, William wasn't around, and she was so excited that she got on a horse and rode all the way into London, she was no rider, to go to Neville Maskelyne to get him to verify that she'd found a comet. And when she reached him, she said, Mr. Maskelyne, I've found another comet and I don't know what to do with it. She'd acquired an excellent knowledge of the heavens, and she became expert at what we now call deep space observation. Between 1786 and 1789, the massive 40-foot telescope was designed, constructed, and erected. It was designed by William and overseen by him. The cost of it was met by a donation of £4,000 out of the king's own pocket and by donations from various aristocrats in the country. It was a very expensive undertaking. This is a photograph of the back of Observatory House. And you can see the circular flower bed which marked the site of the great telescope. It's actually the slightly faint outer ring. Can you see that? And I remember this flower bed when I was a child, and I also have vivid memories of running through a section of the great green painted telescope. And I whooped like a red Indian as I ran through these tubes. There were several of them lying against the garden wall. But it had, of course, been demolished and taken down by the time I ran through it. A lot of the sections weren't capped off. And the remains of the great 40-foot telescope are now displayed in the grounds at Greenwich Observatory. But in its day, it was a well-known tourist attraction because it could be seen by everyone who passed the house on their way to Bath. And the incessant visitors irked Caroline, although she and William received them with tremendous cordiality. And the visitors' book is an incredible list of everyone who was anyone at that time: kings, princes, aristocracy, scientists, writers, politicians, ordinary folk, and they all came to Observatory House to see this telescope and to meet William, who enjoyed in his time the same sort of fame that Yuri Gagarin, John Glenn, and Neil Armstrong enjoy in ours. Did you know that John Glenn's middle name was Herschel? I asked him why he had the name, and he said, I haven't the slightest idea. But he gave me his autograph when he was in Hong Kong. Eventually, William became dissatisfied with the performance of the great 40-foot telescope because it was very heavy and it was very difficult to maneuver, and even with 2 or 3 strong men to push it about, it was not efficient. And he abandoned it, and he returned to using his trusty 20-foot instrument. But the image of the great telescope lives on in the arms of the Royal Astronomical Society and also in the arms of the Herschel family. Somewhere, in fact, in museums and in colleges and universities all over the world, there are volumes and volumes of William's scores for William's music, and even more volumes noting the astronomical discoveries to which he devoted the rest of his long life. But these are for musical scholars and scientific historians. Suffice to say that today we benefit directly from discoveries which William originated. And the most important of these was the discovery of infrared and ultraviolet light. William had been protecting his eyes with colored glass shades, colored glass spectacles. and when he was observing fairly close to the sun, and he noted that different colors of glass produced a different sensation of heat on his skin. He wondered about this, and he devised a simple but elegant experiment using a glass prism, and he directed the divided colors of the spectrum onto small holes in a sheet of wood, the divided colors of the spectrum through small holes in a sheet of wood onto carefully positioned thermometers. And he noted the varying temperatures which each color produced, and then he observed that there are heat-producing rays beyond the red end of the spectrum and cooler rays beyond the violet. He himself felt that this discovery was much more important than the discovery of a planet, and he mused that one day chemists and scientists might be able to make real use of this finding, and so it's proved, with infrared and ultraviolet light having applications in many fields of present-day life. Caroline kept a detailed journal, and she later on wrote a memoir about these busy, productive years, during which William transformed her into an astronomer herself. Night after night, she made her own observations, and eventually she laid claim to the discovery of no less than 8 new comets. And for this, she too was awarded the Copley Medal, the first woman ever to be so honored. She was also appointed officially and at last to be William's assistant, and she was paid £50 a year out of the King's own purse. When you read her journals, you'll realize that she was worried all the time about being dependent on other people. So this £50, and she was extremely frugal, went a very long way. The Herschel set up and ran a small factory for the making of telescopes, and this brought them a substantial income. William did the work of polishing the mirrors himself until he was really quite an old man. He wasn't ever satisfied with anybody else's quality of work. They were able to buy Observatory House and also property in the surrounding area, and you'll realize, of course, that yet another administrative job was foisted on poor Caroline, because she was the one who had to collect the rents. But Caroline was the center, at the hub, of the wheel, which was William Herschel's life and the life of those around him. And he couldn't have done without her, and she was so totally devoted to him that her own life was completely devoid of any emotional involvement. So when William announced in 1788, at the age of nearly 50, that he was going to marry a widow called Mary Pitt, the bottom dropped out of Caroline's life. She did her best to accept the situation, but she poured out her unhappiness and her resentment into her journals. Unfortunately, she later tore these pages out. But Mary Herschel, only picture we've got of her, was a kind and dignified and understanding and patient woman. And she won Caroline round eventually, and their two women became fond of one another. On March the 7th, 1792, a date also shared by one of my grandchildren, not the 1792, but the March the 7th, William's happy marriage gave him a dark-haired, dark-eyed son. And the little boy gave Caroline a focus for affection, which lasted on both sides until she died 56 years later. William and his wife enjoyed a considerable income. He from stipends, rents, and the sale of telescopes, and she from the rents on properties which had been left to her by her father and her first husband. You'll see from this list that William charged the King of Spain £3,150 for a telescope. That's well over £250,000 in today's currency, probably £300,000. Serious cash even today. We're extraordinary the list, and they have actually done quite a lot of research to find out where some of these telescopes are, and a list has been produced of where the surviving telescope, Herschel telescopes are. So William and Mary, not the King and the Queen, but William and Mary Herschel, took regular holidays, and they traveled all over the United Kingdom, and they often went into the developing industrial heartlands, where William was fascinated by the newly invented machinery, which was powering the Industrial Revolution. In 1802, with Europe politically more stable for a while, they were able to travel to France, where William met with continental astronomers and they could at last discuss face-to-face rather than by letter. And William also met Napoleon. And I thought I'd put this particularly self-aggrandizing portrait in. And they had really quite a long conversation about astronomy. But you won't believe this, Napoleon was out of his depth. And he changed the subject extremely quickly from astronomy to the breeding of horses. And I think William was equally out of his depth. So they were quits. From the time of William's arrival in Slough, he was able to devote his time entirely to the exploration of the heavens. And the only way to summarize the vast extent of his observational researches is to say that he was the founder of stellar astronomy. Apart from the discovery of Uranus, he surveyed and catalogued, with Caroline's unstinting help, the whole of the northern sky, discovering in the process no less than 2,500 nebulae. He gave astronomy a metrical picture of our own galaxy, which is seen by us as the Milky Way, and it was he who suggested that we were one galaxy among many. He discovered 2 of the satellites of Saturn, and he located the difference in temperatures outside the range of the spectrum. He achieved a very great deal, and of course more than that. And the list takes 2.5 full pages in the Dictionary of National Biography. In 1716, William Herschel was honoured with a knighthood, which was conferred by the Prince Regent because his friend, the King, was suffering from one of his prolonged bouts of madness. You've probably all seen the film, The Madness of King George. It's very, very sad. And many places have been named after William. There's a beautiful mountain in Antarctica, and in front of that mountain is Edmund Hillary, the man who climbed Everest. There's an island off the coast of Canada. There are 2 or 3 schools. I'm glad to say there's a pub called the Herschel Arms just round the corner from the old observatory house. And there are several streets, and one of the seas of the moon is named after him. And we hope that in 2007 or thereabout, that the European Space Agency will launch the Far Infrared Telescope, which will orbit the Earth and which is to be named Herschel.
And there is a street in Irvine called Herschel.
Is there really? Good.
On the junction of Alton, Discovery, and Herschel.
How fascinating.
How about that?
I must go and have my photograph taken. There's a street in Cambridge named after John. At least I assume it's after John, because he was a scholar there for a long time. William and Mary Herschel had named their son John. And the circumstances of his birth and his upbringing couldn't have been more different from that of his father. From birth, John was in a scientific environment, and he had also the great advantage of an outstanding ability in mathematics. He attended Eton, which was the local school, but he wasn't happy there, and he was educated mainly at home by tutors. At the age of 17, John went up to St. John's College in Cambridge, where he graduated in 1813 as Senior Wrangler. We have some strange titles in England. Senior Wrangler is one of them, and it means that he was overall top in mathematics throughout the entire spectrum of the universities. He was considered to have had the most brilliant academic career of the 19th century, and he swept off all the top prizes at Cambridge, the classical as well as the mathematical. And when he was 21, he was made a Fellow of the Royal Society at a very young age, and a Fellow of St. John's College in Cambridge. And there he applied himself to the study of physics, chemistry, and mathematics. He's a bit of a bore in a way, old John, because aside from being a scientific polymath, he was an excellent musician and a very talented artist and linguist. His lifelong friends included William Whewell, who made the study of tides his life work, and Charles Babbage, who, as we all know, invented the first computer. Curiously, William Herschel wanted his son to go into the church, but John resisted, and he took up a short flirtation with the law. But finally, rather unwillingly, he turned back to science, chemistry, astronomy, and optics, the latter of which led him to the invention of the contact lens. But this couldn't be put at that time to any practical use because of the lack of anesthesia for the eye and of antiseptics. And during these years, John lived mainly at home in Slough. He continued with the augmentation of his father's work and with laying the foundations of what was to become the Royal Astronomical Society. William was appointed as first president, but he was by that time, he was 83, he was too old and too frail to take an active role. William died at Observatory House on Sunday, the 25th of August, 1822, and he was buried at his local church, St. Lawrence at Upton. It's a simple church where he had worshipped and where he had married Mary Pitt. Other Herschel descendants are also buried there, and it's where I was baptized. William's death traumatized Caroline, who was by that time she was 72, and thinking that she wouldn't live for very much longer, she packed up her belongings and she returned to Hanover to live near to her younger brother Dietrich. And it was a decision that she came to regret, because Dietrich died a couple of years after she got back to Hanover, and Caroline lived on, much honored but rather bored, to the age of almost 98. So she was 25 years back in Hanover, and she was disgruntled for most of the time. She adjusted eventually to life away from England, and she kept a lively interest in astronomy to the end of her life. Her nephew John visited her as often as he could, and the visits became the eagerly anticipated highlights of her old age. Caroline died in 1848, so halfway through the 19th century, and she was buried next to her father, who she adored, in the grounds of the Gartenkirchhof in Hanover. This is her grave. It's the size of a mattress, and the writing on it, the epitaph was composed by herself, and it's mostly in praise of William. John was fortunate in that he never had to earn his living. The family's finances were secure enough for him to devote himself to scientific pursuits, to the exclusion of a real social life and the company of women. And he became so unsociable and so grumpy that his friends became thoroughly worried about him, and they arranged for him to meet a cheerful family called Stewart, who were living in London. And it wasn't long before John was strongly attracted to their intelligent and vivacious, and I think beautiful, younger daughter, Margaret. Margaret Brodie Stewart accepted John's proposal of marriage. She wasn't quite 19, and John was 37. They were married in London in 1829, and the marriage was one of unalloyed happiness. It was lastingly passionate, and it produced 12 children. That's passion. They had 3 boys and 9 girls. I thought you'd be interested just to see this picture of the gown that Caroline wore for John's wedding. I think she made it herself. She was a good needlewoman. It looks rather crushed and crumpled, but it is very, very frail, and we don't dare to iron it. In fact, we hardly dare to put it up on the tailor's dummy. John himself was honoured with a knighthood at the age of 39 in 1831. It was bestowed for services to science. John's mother, Mary, lived on until 1832, and after her death, John was able to embark on a long-held ambition to travel down to Cape Town in South Africa to observe, map, and catalogue the heavens of the southern hemisphere. There's a family business going on there, what with the northern and the southern hemisphere. In 1834, John and Margaret, with 2 daughters and their first son, embarked on a ship called the Mount Stuart Elphinstone and they went on the long journey to Cape Town. They were accompanied by 3 servants, who included John's right-hand man, John Stone, who I must mention because he worked with John and for John for his entire life. This expedition was paid for out of John's own pocket, which is a happy circumstance because it means that he wasn't troubled by interference from government or scientific bodies or patrons. A house was found at Farquharson outside Cape Town, and John began work. This is his own drawing of the 20-foot telescope. And when I was in Japan just recently, one of the astronomers there has taken a photograph of that area, and it's a very accurate drawing. Margaret Herschel's letters to her widely scattered family, she had brothers in India, Turkey, China, and Scotland, are full of family news and comments about early colonial life. She was an absolutely wonderful correspondent. She was vivid, lively, descriptive, informative, and loving, just like the lady herself. John called her Maggie, and she usually referred to him in her letters as my dear Herschel. She gave birth to 3 more children while she was at the Cape, and she seems to have taken these continual pregnancies completely in her stride. She also occasionally helped John with the cataloguing, but I think with her nights taken up in other ways. The great work of mapping the heavens of the southern hemisphere was carried out systematically and thoroughly, but it didn't take up all of John Herschel's time. The family undertook regular excursions into the countryside around Cape Town and used these trips to sketch, draw, and paint the flora and the landscape of the region. The resulting lovely pictures are a collaboration between John and Margaret. He did the drawings using his camera lucida. You probably all know what this gadget is. It's the only picture which I could find which satisfactorily showed how it's used. It's a lens which throws the view down onto the paper so that you can copy the outline. It's absolutely useless unless you can draw. And these are but 4 of the dozens of botanical drawings which John and Margaret did while they were at the Cape. And the folios are now in the South African archives. At the top left is a bright blue orchid-like flower. Its common name is the blue Deezer, but its botanical name is Graminifolia herscheliana, and it was given this name to honor John. They kept journals describing all the people they met and the sights they saw, and these are now valuable archives in the history of South Africa. These interludes were educational for the children as well as relaxing for John. He wasn't a very strong man, and Margaret was very sensitive to him and ordered their lives to give him as much rest as possible. In Margaret's honor, John wrote this poem to celebrate the 12th anniversary of their marriage. I'll let you read it for yourselves. Done? I'd have stuck with the man who wrote that for me. John wasn't only busy with his astronomical work, but also much involved in discussions relating to education at the Cape. These discussions became very acrimonious because John felt that every child should be educated, no matter their race or their religion. And his opponents held the opposite view. In this, I feel that one can feel him harking back to the humble origins of his grandfather, and one can also feel him looking forward in a liberal way to the necessity for children to learn. Universal compulsory education didn't come to England until after John had died. John, like his grandfather Isaac, was involved in the intellectual upbringing of his children. Their schoolroom, at the house they eventually lived in, Collingwood, was equipped with a sink and a draining board, tables and equipment for scientific experiments, and a sandpit for the babies. And they had a gym in one of the barns. And even when he was an ailing and bedridden old man, he used to teach his youngest daughter Latin and Greek. They were tucked up in bed early in the morning together, and she remembered those lessons fondly because they were real fun. And fun was to be had in other ways too. This fantastical picture illustrated a hoax story, written, I'm sorry to say, by an American, which said that John Herschel had discovered that there was life on the moon. The story was widely believed, and it caused a sensation. But it didn't reach John, who was in South Africa at the time, until about a year later, and he laughed himself silly and publicly repudiated the notion. The Herschels were socially high-ranking in Cape Town, but they were actually disinterested in social life, and they preferred their own company and that of their closer friends and their children. But John's eminence brought them many famous visitors, most of them on their way to and from India and the Far East. And one of these visitors was Charles Darwin. This is a picture of Darwin as a young man. At the time, he traveled around the world in the Beagle. He went via the Horn of South America to the Galapagos Islands and then under the Cape. And he arrived with John halfway through the time that they were at the Cape. And John and Darwin spent several days together walking on Table Mountain and discussing Darwin's theories on the origins of species. Darwin himself didn't record these meetings at the time, but he referred to John by writing that he was exceedingly good-natured, but his manners at first appeared to me to be rather awful. He's living in a very comfortable country home, and he seems to find time for everything, including gardening. In fact, John brought back a large number of botanical specimens for the gardens at Kew. This is John's memorial at Feldhausen. You'll see that the base is in the shape of a star, and I noticed that the Griffith Memorial also has the base in the shape of a star, Griffith's Observatory. And the man in the picture is Patrick Moore, who is England's popular television astronomer. Some of you have probably heard of him or even heard him speak. He's now unfortunately, an ailing man. And the work of mapping the southern hemisphere was completed, and the family returned to England just in time for the coronation of Queen Victoria in 1838. And in the coronation honours, John's knighthood was upgraded to a baronetcy, which is an inheritable title, and which he passed on to his eldest son and his grandson. This is the Herschel family crest. You can see the 40-foot telescope is shown in the middle, and the astronomical sign for Uranus is above that. The helmet is the helmet, and the stuff around the side is called mantling, and that denotes a baronetcy. The sieve on the top, I reckon, is the constellation of the Northern Hemisphere. But quite what the Golden Eagle's doing there, I don't know. I'm extremely proud to be able to tell you that this is considered to be the very worst coat of arms ever devised by the College of Heralds. When John got back from South Africa, his most pressing task was to collate and analyze all the observations that he'd made down at the Cape. It was a monumental undertaking, and it took him 10 years. He didn't have a Caroline to help him. And he finished the job just in time to take the first copy to his ancient Aunt Caroline in Hanover. And he took it himself, and it was the last time they saw one another. The family retained ownership of Observatory House in Slough, but it was too small for John's large family, so they moved to a house called Collingwood at Hawkhurst in Kent, and it was here that John and Margaret lived out the rest of their lives. As a chemist and a physicist, John became interested in the new subject of photography, and he was friends with the photographic pioneer William Henry Fox Talbot. John devised the first method of fixing a photographic image so that it would not fade on exposure to light. He used hypersulfates of soda, and he passed the method on to Fox Talbot in 1839, only to find Fox Talbot patenting the system and getting the money on his own account in 1843. John invented words which are commonplace to us today: positive, negative, and snapshot. And this is the first photograph which John took and used his new method to fix. It's blurred, but you can see that it's the great 40-foot telescope, which was just at that point in the process of being dismantled, and that was in 1839. This photograph is printed on glass. And as an old man, John had his photograph taken by the photo portrait pioneer Julia Margaret Cameron, and this is it. He doesn't look too happy about it. Apparently, Julia Margaret Cameron was a bossy woman, and she took the liberty of mussing up his hair and plonking the velvet berry on his head, despite his objections. He was a fastidious and well-groomed man, but he was also, by that time, in poor health. But the result is this stunning portrait, which is actually the very best of Julia Margaret Cameron's range of work. And Julia Margaret Cameron gave John Herschel a lovely green leather-bound album of her photographs because they were godparents to each other's children. This album is now called the Herschel album, and it's at the Museum of Cinema and Photography in Bradford in England, and it has the status of a national treasure. John was loaded with honours, and like Isaac Newton before him, he was appointed to be Master of the Mint. It was an onerous job which required a polymath scientist, chemist, and physicist to do. John was never a company man or a team leader, and he was unhappy, though he was competent, with the minutiae of public life and committee meetings. Among his achievements in this work was the design and constitution of the American currency at that time, and an abortive attempt to change sterling into a metric system. We only did that 30 years ago, so he was well ahead of his time. His health began to fail. He had stomach ulcers and gout, which forced him to use a wheelchair, and as this little watercolour shows. But he wasn't so frail that he didn't welcome the birth of his last daughter at the age of 68. She is the baby in this picture. John Herschel was considered to be the preeminent scientific polymath of his day, but his reputation didn't live on for very long after his death. Perhaps this is because he didn't make any new discoveries which changed the parameters of science or the way in which the world is perceived. He was essentially what one might call a dilettante scientist. He had enough money to work only on things that interested him, and he spent much time in augmenting and refining his father's work. His achievements became dated by the last quarter of the 19th century, when science broke down into more specialist and separate disciplines. He was the last of those men who, over 100 years before, had powered the movement of thought and invention into the modern age. John died on the 11th of May, 1871, and he was buried at our national shrine, Westminster Abbey, next to his friend Charles Darwin, and about 3 meters away from the tomb of Isaac Newton. And Newton's elaborate tomb shows only 6 planets. Margaret, the lovely Margaret, lived on for another 14 years, and she died in 1884. John and Margaret had 12 children, 3 boys and 9 girls, who were, of course, William Herschel's grandchildren. The first was Caroline. She married well to the second son of the 4th Earl of Aberdeen. He became an army general, and Caroline herself was appointed as a lady-in-waiting to Queen Victoria at the time when the Queen was so much in mourning for Prince Albert, and her letters show that she found the job to be extremely boring and trying. The second was Isabella, who died unmarried. William James came third, and I'll tell you a bit more about him in a minute. He was my great-grandfather. Where are we? Oh, yes. The fourth was Margaret Louisa, who married a man called Reginald Marshall. And I must tell you this story because I think it's funny. An encounter took place between one of the Marshall descendants and my daughter Annie a few years ago. Annie had gone to an open-air concert in a large group made up of friends and friends of the friends, and the program included Holst's Planet Suite. And the young man lolling on the grass next to Annie said, I always liked this music because, you see, I had an ancestor who discovered a planet. Said Annie, so did I, which I think is the ultimate put down. And they discovered, to their astonishment, that they were cousins. The fifth was a son, Alexander, who became an astronomer and a mathematician in his own right. He specialized in the study of meteors. He became a professor at what is now Newcastle University, where there is a building named after him, a particularly ugly building. The sixth was also a son named John, gloomy-looking man, had no children. He spent most of his life in the army, and his wife was useful because she wrote a memoir of the Herschels, which was pretty accurate. And then things became slightly complicated because the seventh child, Maria Sophia, married Henry Hardcastle, who was brother to her sister-in-law, Emma, and Emma was married to William James. So in other words, a brother and a sister married a brother and a sister. Maria, poor girl, had 10 children. Amelia was the eighth child, and she married an interesting man. His name was Sir Thomas Wade, and he had been the first Chinese secretary to the government in the newly acquired colony of Hong Kong. I didn't know this until recently, and as I lived in Hong Kong for years, it did particularly take my attention. He was fluent in several Chinese languages, and he did a lot of work on opening up China to trade with the West. He eventually became the first professor of Chinese at Cambridge. He married Amelia in 1868, and they had 3 sons, and among their descendants is the international best-selling author Gerald Seymour. Julia Mary, yes, I've got the right slide, was born in 1842. She married a naval officer who was the son of the Herschel's great friend Maclear, who had been the astronomer down at the Cape. I don't think the family, from the rumours I hear, were very pleased about the marriage because he was an impecunious naval officer when she married him, but he did the right thing. He became an admiral. Francisca didn't marry. Her name's spelt Francisca rather than Francesca, in honor of Francis Bailey, of Bailey's beads, the phenomenon that shows itself up when the moon is going into eclipse. He was 4 times president of the Royal Astronomical Society. Matilda Waterfield, wearing the awful hat, married into a diplomatic family, and we're still closely associated with this particular branch of Herschel's descendants. The youngest, the last, the baby born when he was 68, was Constance Anne. And it was she who remembered, as a small child, tucking up in bed with her father to be taught Greek and Latin. She was this is interesting, she was one of the first 6 women in England to go to university, to Girton. And she acquired a degree in natural sciences. She married, as his second wife, Sir Neville Lubbock, who was professor of mathematics at Cambridge. And it's rather sad. Neville Lubbock, by his first wife, had 5 sons and a daughter, and by Constance Anne, he had 5 daughters and a son, and the son was slaughtered age 16 at the Battle of Jutland, and I think that's really terrible. Constance Anne died only 3 months before I was born in 1939. And now let's go back to William James. He was born in 1833, and he's a little boy who travelled down to Cape Town with his parents. He was educated at a college called Haileybury, which was a school founded to educate the sons, to educate boys for service in the colony and empire. He spoke several Indian dialects. In 1858, he was posted to India as a magistrate to Bengal, where he remained to complete 20 years of service. And during this time, he was very much troubled by contractors who were dishonest and repudiated their signatures on the contracts and demanded more money. He'd been studying and looking at the permanence of fingerprints from the time he was really quite a small boy, taking fingerprints of his baby brothers and sisters. And for the first time, he used fingerprints on a semi-official basis in 1858. This is a picture of the first ever print made for the purposes of identification. It's the handprint of an Indian workman called Konai, and he shambled off into the mists of history, never knowing that his name would always be remembered in certain circles. William James continued with the investigating the permanence of fingerprints, and by 1877 he was confident enough to use the method officially. And then he took the system back to England and introduced it to Scotland Yard. And with a great deal of help from a clever man called Henry Foulds, they devised methods of classification, walls and arches and loops, and fingerprints began to be used in the detection of crime. William James and his wife had 4 children. His wife was called Emma Hardcastle, and the first child was Margaret, died of meningitis age 15. And then down below, my beloved great-aunt Emma Dorothea, who we always called Old Aunt, and who brought up my aunts and my mother after my grandparents had died. My great-uncle John, up in the corner, was in holy orders and not considered to be very bright. And my grandfather, Arthur Herschel, who, like his wife, Ellen, died before I was born. Arthur was a civil engineer, and he specialized in concrete as a building material, and he joined a team that went out to Kingston in Jamaica in the early 1900s to rebuild the civic buildings in Kingston after a hurricane. My mother, Marjorie, was born in Jamaica in 1909, and she died aged 32 in 1942, when I was only 3. Sadly, my grandmother had developed blood poisoning late in her 4th pregnancy, and her son, the last Herschel boy, was stillborn. And with that little death, the extraordinary Herschel dynasty came to an end. Thank you.
That was a very interesting presentation. Thank you so much to Charlotte herself for stopping by and sharing her family history with us. Hearing about the achievements of the Herschels from a Herschel seems to bring the whole thing so much closer. Next month, we'll be featuring a presentation from Keith McInnes on rocket men, insights for successful space exploration. Look out for his incredible collection of space program artifacts, including items that have been to the moon and back. Until next time, go outside and look up tonight.